Howdy everyone, welcome to Nashcræft with Brady. Today, I'll be reviewing a adventure for Shadowdark, specifically a dungeon called Into the Barrow, where I'll be sharing my thoughts and providing some GM tips in case you want to run this for your group. Okay, so let's get right into it. This adventure is one that I've used a lot in my campaign. I'm actually still using it today. I have referenced it a few times in some of my other videos, and so I just want to show you exactly how I'm using it and how easy it is to stitch it into your campaign in case you're running at West Marches as well. And if this adventure sounds like something you would like to play if you're a player, make sure you send this video to your GM. So this adventure is on DriveThruRPG for just $2 by Matthew Aaron Gorman. He's got another free dungeon on there as well. And for just $2, you're going to get a massive dungeon with 3 levels that has all the great trappings of a classic dungeon as far as looking for traps, being wary of certain items, and an interesting little backstory within the dungeon itself that my players really had a good time exploring and uncovering and sleuthing out. Now, one little caveat here is that it does say it is a horror-themed dungeon, and I would say it's mostly very true on the first level. So once again, not trying to spoil anything here, but as far as descriptions go, the heads up, there are a bunch of cannibal humanoids or cannibal humans in the first layer. So just if you want to censor that or, maybe switch up a little bit, that was one. It's a part of the story as well, as far as like maybe why they're cannibals and crazy. But in case that's maybe a little stomach churning, just a heads up, that's like the one thing that maybe I would switch out in case it was a particular kind of audience maybe. But otherwise, the dungeon is solid. There's plenty of other monsters and beasts of that nature, so that way it's not just the humans that you're dealing with all the time. And once again, I have to reiterate that my players had a great time with this dungeon. It's been seeded into my larger campaign world that I've often called it King's Barrow, is what I renamed it here, into my larger West Marches campaign. It's the dungeon that's pretty much closest to the initial hub town, and it's one that my players have gone to multiple times, and it's sort of become its own, expanded dungeon from my own add-ons to it over time. But let's get here into the review. So since this is a paid product, I'm not going to go through the entire thing, but I want to try to give you a little bit of snapshots for each level and maybe take a little more extended look at the first level a little bit. So Into the Barrow of the Long Forgotten King by Matthew Aaron Gorman. And I believe in the Curse Scroll #1 for Shadowdark's official expansion, there is a hex that has some sort of barrow of some kind, and so it doesn't have a dungeon specifically laid out for you, but just like I've sort of done, all I did is take this dungeon and insert it into that hex, and so when the players enter that hex, this is the dungeon that they'll find when they get there. So moving on down through the credits here, and we'll come to the essentially the background of this dungeon, and it's designed for levels 1 to 3. And having run this with some parties that were like level 1 and only using 2 players sometimes, yes, it is a very deadly dungeon. They may only get so far before needing to head back to town if they're not really able to. There's only so much luck you can press sometimes with low HP. And so a larger party of level 1s, 4 to 5 would definitely be more suitable to this adventure. And heck, the way that Shadowdark works sometimes, I've even had high-level players, like literally level 8, 9 wizard probably come through here too, with some other lower levels, maybe anywhere from between 1 and 5 with that particular player. And, per the way that encounters work and Shadowdark's HP system, anything can always be deadly, which is sort of a beautiful thing in regards to Shadowdark. But expect there to be some blood if your party is composed of low-level characters until you maybe get into that level 2, level 3 range, and you can kind of take a hit or two. And there is plenty of things to do in this dungeon. Like I said, mine's been seeded into a West Marches campaign, so they've been able to revisit over and over and over again and get to know it on different aspects. And as we get into some of that, it was really cool to see the community share their different understandings of the dungeon. And so the background of this dungeon is that it's one of 3 different tombs, the other 2 having been raided long ago, and this is the last one to have any valuable treasure in it, and your party essentially discovers where it is, and the adventure just opens up with them at the entrance of the Barrow, which I think is totally fine. I like to just get the players right into the action. Maybe once you've already established your campaign, or if you're already mid campaign or into a West Marches campaign, then you can still just read that entrance. When they come upon it, you just kind of skip past the other paragraph or two, and you can just kind of read what it's like standing. Now you're at the entrance of this particular dungeon here, and that's all that's really important. So the dungeon is split up into 3 layers, essentially. The first layer that you're going to be going through, the one that you are introduced at the beginning of the entrance I just described, is the hidden tunnels. And the characters must navigate their way through a treacherous maze of tunnels that lead into the burial mound proper. So you're like in these caverns instead, and this is where those cannibal humanoids I mentioned earlier are. And there's a bit of a mystery involving a blue flame that it has probably something to do with all of this craziness down here. Now, one of the best parts about this dungeon is that on this first level, there's a mine shaft that your players can find that was probably dug out by some dwarves at some time in the past, and if they search hard enough, they'll come across a gold vein that they can spend actions hacking off ores of gold that will give them good chunks of gold. Super exciting for them. But every time you go to mine some, it's going to trigger a potential encounter. So I love that risk-reward balance there as far as Shadowdark and OSR games are concerned. How much gold can you get out before tons of cave rats and cannibals come crawling down the cavern holes and floods the little room that you're in? Highly disturbing and creepy, right? And the players lopped it up, and they brought multiple expeditions and had multiple different people get to come and get their own little gold ores out of this one little vein. And it has a quite a bit of mountain. So you, as a GM, my players came back here multiple times, so I was tracking how much gold it had over time and describing how it was, dwindling and dwindling. More often they came back and more often they came back. But it was a very fun experience for them, and great game mechanic balancing that, like I said, the risk reward and how much gold can you get out before all the encounters start to bear down on you. And now the second part of the tumulus is when you're going to start seeing some undead and skeletons, and more of this mystery of the blue flame starts to come into full view. There will be a boss fight that is essentially, once again, spoilers, do not look at this if you're a player, but there is a boss undead king of sorts, and my party had discovered him and ran away the first time that they met him. And I have a large player base. Maybe at the time we had maybe 10 players that were kind of rotating in and out on the West Marches schedule, but enough players had heard about this giant sarcophagus and massive undead lichy king guy that needed some beatdown, and so the players organized and led a expedition there to go confront him and defeat him, and thus they did. And here's a picture done by the artist, one of our players, Aaron Lenk, in this amazing captured moment of this campaign where they were defeating the king of King's Barrow. Now, as that happens, if you defeat the king, or if and when, there essentially is a hole that opens up in the ground, and down goes a bunch of the treasure in the sarcophagus, and then we end up in part 3. And so the third level of the dungeon, if your players come back and can get down the hole, or if in that moment they decide to dump down the hole, they will find themselves in a sort of underground river area, and they'll come across a creepy raft of sorts, a Charon raft maybe, and the players will get on it, and it'll traverse down this river channel of sorts, and there'll be encounters from mutant or creepy fishmen, eels, and then towards the end, while they're waiting for this last door to open so the raft can float through, they will fight or be attacked or ambushed by a giant crab, as depicted here. And in case, you may need to, and this is where it gets a little wonky as far as stitching in some other aspects. Luckily, I was sort of relatively close enough to a coast, because the crab is supposed to have come from literally like the sea. So when you're in this underground river, and somehow it's going to lead you out to the ocean, or that's what the module says. So if you're like not anywhere near anything like that, you might want to consider spitting them out like in a lake somewhere, or some other underneath near a mountain maybe. Maybe whatever you need to do to make that work for you. just the heads up that that underground river, it will tell you that, oh, it opens up to the sea. You can smell salty air and that sort of stuff. So if that doesn't really make sense or canonically jive, just make sure for GMs, make sure you have a plan of some sort for that. Otherwise, it's going to be your typical adventure. You're going to get some rumors. It'll show you all the random encounters that we have for each single level. Here's the introduction that you can read to your players as they come upon it. Now, after braving the many perils of the dark and savage wilderness, the clouds of stinging insects, the bitter howling wind, a nearly fatal mudslide, and a ravenous pack of wolves, you stand at last before your destination. In front of you lies the mouth of a cavern, all but hidden from view by a veil of thorny vines. It leads into the cold and inky darkness beyond. You will need some source of light now, should you wish to continue. And this dungeon is going to come with maps, player maps, everything that you'll need in order to run this. One of the interesting things that the creator did for this dungeon is seed little treasure maps on bodies throughout the dungeon. So players will find these, and I had just snipped them and copied and pasted into Discord because that's where I play. But you could just print these out or crudely draw them yourselves if you really want to. But yeah, they have them seeded out for your players to find these maps, and they can start to try to map the dungeon themselves and figure out what parts are where. And sometimes I had different players find different parts of the maps and have to stitch them together and see how this dungeon was actually laid out. Just want to spotlight other creators' work that I have used before and can attest to and recommend Into the Barrow. Links for it will be down below in the description, and make sure you also check out my DriveThruRPG page for any Shadowdark needs you might have. Have a good one.